Hi YouTube, welcome to Car and Mechanical, and today I'm going to take you through how to fix and repair a Peugeot 206 rear trailing arm by replacing the bearings that have worn out in it. So the first thing we're going to look at, I'm just going to show how much wheel movement there is. So obviously that's going to be quite scary, not a great thing to have whilst you're driving around. So let's get the wheel off. Let's take the hubcap cover off first. We'll get the bolts undone, we'll get the wheel off, and we're just going to explain where we're seeing the issues on this. Also worth noting that the car has been jacked up and put on jack stands just to make sure it's nice and stable as we work on it. Now the failed bearing is in the rear trailing arm, which you can just see there at the top right hand part of the screen. However, it's sometimes misdiagnosed as being the wheel bearing. Now you can see there from the new cover that this has already been replaced on this car. However, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to remove pretty much everything here in order to get to the bearing we want to replace. Okay, so just to briefly explain the suspension system, we have the subframe brackets which are attached to the tube which runs across the centre of the car and the car's rear suspension arm there, which the wheel is attached to. We have two torsion bars, so we have a lower torsion bar and a higher torsion bar. These are sprung across the car, and we also have the anti-roll bar that runs across the middle here. So in order to start, let's have a look at what we're going to take off. So the first thing we're going to look at taking off is the brake pipe top clip. So that is just in the top there. It's a little bit dark, but it's just above the anti-roll bar plate. Just that. We're also going to take off the lower clip. We're going to need to take off the brake and hub unit. We're also going to have to take off the brake bias compensation valve, which is just up there. That adjusts for rear brake bias. We're going to take off the handbrake cable bracket. Then just below there, we're going to undo the damper bolt. We have the torsion bar that needs to be taken out as well, so we're going to unbolt that. And we have the anti-roll bar plate that is going to get undone and taken off as well. So just as we get to work, I'm going to use some plus gas just to get in there and just to loosen up some of the bolts that might be a bit tight, which haven't been taken off probably for years. Okay, so we've come round to the passenger side of the car. The anti-roll bar connects to two sides of the suspension. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take off the anti-roll bar plate in order for the anti-roll bar to be taken out from the other side of the car. So that's a 13mm bolt there. I'm just going to speed that up nice and quickly so we can see where we're getting to. The little bung plug there is a T40 plug. So we're just going to undo that quickly as well. Now I do recommend when you are working on stuff, if you do have somewhere nice tray organiser to put everything, to put it in there. What we're going to look at next is we're going to look at how we're going to remove this plate cover. So if you put an M12 by 1.5mm bolt in, we're going to screw that in and that will pull the plate off. Now what you want to be careful of is making sure you use the right fitting, because with a Peugeot, the wheel bolts it comes with are M12 by 1.2. If you use that, you're going to screw up the thread for what you've already got. So you want to make sure you use a 1.5. If you can, grab it from a scrappies, or if you happen to have a friend that's got a VW, quickly pinch one of their spare wheel bolts if they have one. So we're going to screw this in. We're going to tighten it up, and you'll see as it tightens, you just see the plate come loose. There we go. So we're going to undo that again. We're just going to get back to it, and just for safekeeping, we're going to put the T40 plug back into place. Again, if you've got somewhere you're keeping everything, just to be safe, you can keep it to one side. Everyone's got their own way of working that works for them. Okay, so let's undo that 13mm all the way. That'll just take a moment there. So when that comes off, it might be a bit stiff. You might want a pry bar, but it will come off. So once it is off, we can just remove that plate there. We can then just see it into the anti-roll bar. See a little bit of corrosion in there, but that's where we're going to get the anti-roll bar out from. Okay, so to hold the bolt on the back of the rear damper in place, we're going to use a spanner on a jack to stop that from rotating whilst we undo that from the front. So you can see that we're undoing this from the front there. And once we do get that undone, what we're then going to do is we're just going to knock through the bolt, or the damper bolt there, just so we can get to it. and we're going to take the load off of the damper so we can pull that through and take that and tuck that out of the way. Okay, so next we're going to take out the handbrake bracket and the brake line. So although the angle doesn't show it too well, this is the handbrake bracket that we showed earlier, so we're just going to undo that. I will label the video for any fittings, so I'm not sure offhand what that one is, but you will magically see that on screen already. So once that's done, tuck that out of the way. What we're then going to do is we're going to do the brake bias on top and the fitting that is attached to. So again, this is a little bit like a brake caliper. You want to brace one of the rear bolts, or the rear bolt, and then you want to undo that with a socket. So once you've got that undone, be very careful because you've got a spring for your brake bias that you don't want to mess up too much. But you can move that out of the way of the suspension trailing arm. And then once you do that, you've got the clip that you can just see there. So that will come on clip from the top, and then the secondary clip partway down. Now if you have got ABS as well, you may need to remove the ABS line as well, which will be popped in just there. So we're going to move these to one side, and then we're going to move on to the hub. Okay, so moving on to the brake and hub unit, we're first going to go around and we're going to take off that bearing cover. So just going to loosen that nice and gently, and I'm going to go with a pry bar and get in there. So once the cap comes off that we can see there, we can see into the sort of central locking nut for the hub. Now this has been staked, that's where it's sort of hit inward to tighten the nut so it doesn't move. So we're going to unstake it. So we're going to use a screwdriver or a chisel, and you're just going to hit that from behind to unstake it. I would recommend looking up other videos on staking and reading into it if you are unsure on this element. Okay, so with the hub nut unstaked, we're going to undo that. So use a nice brake bar you've got there, because you're going to need it to get that started going. Unscrew it. As you can see there, we've just started it off, we've undone it with the socket, and the drum cover will then just come off. So it's just going to need a bit of side to side movement just to get it undone, and it will then come off as so. And inside we can see the brake mechanism and hydraulics. So we're not going to touch those, but just to point them out, we've got the hydraulics there and we've got the brake mechanism down there. But what we want to undo is these 4 bolts here. So we're going to undo those so we can remove the hub and the backing plate. So let's get those undone in a nice quick sped up motion for you. Again, just make sure you put those somewhere safe, because this is going to come off for a bit and it's not going to go back on until we're near on finished. So the last one, we're going to take that off, and it should pull forward, but it might need a bit of persuasion. So if you have got sort of a sand-filled mallet or a rubber mallet, you might want to get back there and just to hit that off, as we've done there, and it will just come forward. So we're just going to pop that to one side to secure that. And next we're going to take off the brake line. So this clip's actually halfway across underneath the middle of the car at the rear. Okay, so now we're going to move across to the anti-roll bar plate. We're going to use the 13mm socket to undo the anti-roll bar plate. So I'm just going to speed that up there. And once this is done, we're going to use a pry bar just to get in behind the anti-roll bar plate and just to loosen it off. You might find, depending on how long it's been on there or what condition it's in underneath there, that you're going to find a bit of effort is going to be needed. So initially using the pry bar just to snap things off, it's not coming quite out. One of the other things you find when you are filming, you're trying to stay completely out of shot, so you're not able to get in there and perhaps really lever things like you normally would do, because you're holding everything at arm's length. So that's now about ready to come out. So we're going to stand out the way so we can film this coming out, and the anti-roll bar is going to pull out. We can see the corrosion on there, and that kind of gives us a hint as to what the condition's like inside everything. So with the anti-roll bar out, we're going to take off the torsion bar end cap, and there's a washer underneath there as well. And that will enable us to take off the rear trailing arm. So what we're going to do is a T40 bit to undo that. So once you've undone that and put your cap to one side, there's a washer under there that you might find is quite stuck in place like we did. So we used a needle gun on it to loosen it because it wasn't quite doing what we wanted with a hammer and a screwdriver. But once it's loosened up, it will come out easy enough. You might just want to use some brake cleaner, anything just to loosen it if you do find it is quite stiff. The trailing arm just needs a bit of gentle persuasion from side to side and it will then just come out. Okay, so looking into the trailing arm, we can see the condition that that bearing has actually gotten into. It's completely corroded and collapsed on itself, and if we look at the other side, we can see what a brand new one looks like compared to what we're left with. So you want to remove the bearing and all traces of the bearing before we start to work on putting the new bearings into place. Now these aren't going to slide out, but luckily they won't need to be pressed out due to the condition that they're actually in. So keep working at this with whatever you've got. So if you've got a hammer and screwdriver, if you've got anything you might want to cut it with, a bit of a saw or something if the bearing's in better condition. But just keep hitting away if you do have a hammer and screwdriver or chisel, whatever you do choose to use until you get that out. If you look into the trailing arm as well, you can see there's a centre cavity there. And in a minute you'll see the amount of dust and debris on the side. You can get quite a bit of rust that finds its way right up into that section. Okay, so we're going to start working on the inner bearing to take this one out. This one was quite a bit more stuck. So the initial part comes out, but we're left with the outer casing. So I think what we do with that is I think we try using some air tools. I think we might split it a bit initially and then we finish it off with the hammer and the screwdriver just to get it out. Just prior to that though, we try and get out as much of the inside as possible. It's not actually the worst job in the world, but here we're just going to give it some good pressure just to release the bearing casing. So as soon as it's split, it should just come out. And obviously for the ease of video editing I've been able to cut this out, but it only took a couple more minutes all in all. So now we've released that pressure, this should just pop out, which it will do there. And as we take it off, again we're left with some of the bearing stuck on the inside. So we're just going to get out that last bit we can see there. And as we come up in a minute, as we get that last bit out, you're going to see all the dust, debris and the rust that's come from that inside column of the centre trailing arm. So bearing in mind that you're going to be putting new bearings in and new grease, you don't want any of that dust or rust to come back up and to make a mess of everything. And then continue to tidy it up. We're going to use an air tool with a flat wheel just to clean everything up and just to get the inside of that rear trailing arm looking nice and clean so it's ready to accept the new bearings. Okay, so we're going to put the outside bearing or the outside of the trailing arm bearing in first. So they do come pre-greased. So you're just going to line it up and gently tap it in with a hammer. And using a large socket set in a minute, luckily it lines up just over the bearing and that enables us to just to hit it home down to the point it needs to get to. So just tapping all over the socket until it gets down to just the point you want it at. So just repeat it until it ends up in just the right position. I can't remember the exact measurement going down. If I can find it out, I will put that on screen so you'll see that now. And we're just going to pop the rubber seal over there. Now I noticed when we were taking the old kit out, I didn't see any seal whatsoever, but that probably explains how we got to where we got to. So again, you can just use a socket again. I'm sure it will go in by hand, but it's just using whatever the easiest method that you can find for yourself is. So just tapping it around nice and evenly so it goes in just as you want that to. Okay, so now we're going to put the bearing on the inside of the trailing arm. We had difficulty in getting this to line up and push down evenly. It wanted to keep tilting to one side or the other. So we use a couple of sockets to try and start it off with some even pressure, and eventually we get it to start finding its way down. So I think we're using something like a 34mm large socket there, and eventually as we get it to go down, we just start to slowly tamp it in, and we keep checking it. So we take the socket away and we just make sure that it's in the right place, and eventually we do get there and we get it all of the way down evenly. So after the bearing's in place, we're going to use some high temperature grease. I'll put this in both sides. I've only shown it on the one, but it's important to be quite liberal with this. You don't want to use too little. Equally, you don't want to use massive amounts because you're just going to make a mess when you put everything back together. But you want to make sure you've got enough in there. So where we're going to move to next is we're going to put everything back on. So installation is the opposite of removal. And we've made some helpful marks whilst we've been doing that, as you can see there, to see the exact measurement and how far everything should be when it goes back in. So we're going to put the rear trailing arm back on, and we're going to line it up. So most of it should bolt in, and that should be a pretty good determiner of where we want that to go. But we also made a measure before we took it off, so we can sort of just see how far that is. So we've marked that to 220mm. So that's from that point there to where the rear trailing arm is. And we can see that's at 220, so that's where it's going to get tightened up to. And we're just going to find that is spot on. Okay. So now we've found the measurements of where we want it to be, we're going to knock the trailing arm in using a lump hammer. You can use a sand-filled mallet, a rubber mallet, whatever you're happy with, but you just want to get this all the way on. Now before we put the anti-roll bar back in, we're going to clean off some of this corrosion. So we're going to use a flap wheel again on an airline tool. And we're just going to clean off and take off as much of this old stuff that's all sort of nasty and corroded as possible. This is probably actually the seal that we mentioned earlier. So now that's briefly cleaned up, we're going to put the anti-roll bar in. So as you put it in, just make sure it finds all of its way home. You might find it gets a little bit caught up until you get exactly the right position. So once we've got the anti-roll bar pushed in all the way, and finding its home position, we're going to put the 13mm bolt back in, and we're going to tighten that up before going back over to the passenger side in a minute. And we're going to use a jack underneath the trailing arm to get this bolt hole just to line up perfectly, so it's a bit shy of where it should be, but just a little bit of jacking, and we can find out if we raise it up, we find a position just about we want there, so the bolt will go straight in. Okay, so now that's lined up, you want to put a 30mm nut back in there. We're going to switch back over to the driver's side, and we're going to put the hub back on. So we'd moved this to one side earlier, but now we're going to line it up. We're going to get the 4 torx screws, and we're going to do all of those up. So once we've got the 4 torx screws done up, we're going to put the hub cover back on. You might want to use your rubber mallet on this, or your sand-filled mallet, or your hammer or anything, just to get it to find home. Once it's back on, put the centre nut back on, screw this up. You can start it by hand, or you can use your socket if you've got that, but just tighten it up as much as possible. You don't need to over torque it, but you do want to restake it. So we spoke about that earlier, just to look that one up if you're unsure on what that is. But you basically hit the nut out when you undo it, and you knock it in tight when you're doing it back up. And we're going to put the cap cover back in as well, so it's going to hit that nice and evenly all over. Okay, so with the hub on, we're now going to put this washer in that I mentioned was quite hard to take out earlier. So line it up as best you can by hand, then use something to hit it in without damaging it. And once it's in, you can see it's not allowing the nut to go in just yet. So we're just going to continue to hit that in a little bit because it's not finding its way home. But when it does find its way home, you then just want to move it over so your nut can just be pushed in. So this is for the torsion bar end cap. So we're going to put the T40 bit end cap back in here, and that's just going to screw up to home. Okay, so we're going to put the top brake line bracket into place, which also has the spring for the brake bias compensation valve. So when we're done, we want to make sure that spring is hooked up into place where it should be on the back there. What you also want to do is make sure that the brake line is hooked in further on, just there on the trailing arm, as you can see. What we're also going to do is we're going to put the damper bolts back into place. So we're going to hold a spanner on the back, and we're just going to tighten that one from the front there. We'll get that nice and tight and torqued up. And the brake line that just clips on underneath the middle back of the car, so that will just push in by hand, so we're just going to clip that in there. Lastly, we're going to put the handbrake cable back into place. So we're just going to line that up, and after we've done that, I want to put the wheel on, and we're going to see if we've got any of the play that we had earlier. So if we remember right at the beginning, before we took anything off, there was quite a bit of play in the wheel. What this meant when you was driving along, you got quite a bit of vibration, and you wouldn't have got a very nice road handling characteristic from the car. So we're going to pop the wheel back on, we're going to get the bolts done up, and we're going to put some nice hard pressure on this. We're not going to go light. we want to put some decent amount of pressure to see if we get the wobble we had earlier, and we got absolutely nothing at all. So we can see, literally, even without going out and driving it, we can see that we've had a massive improvement from this kit that has been used. And again, just for a final comparison, on the right is how things were before, and on the left is what we've now got afterwards. The total cost of this job ended up being £15 for a kit from eBay. Now, the car's previous owner had been quoted over £400 from a garage to replace the entire rear beam and not just to replace the bearings. So you can see that if you're willing to invest some time and you have the tools behind you to do it, you can save quite a bit of money and make it worth doing this job on the car. I hope you found this video useful. If you are considering doing the same thing yourself, please like and share it if you have done. If you would like to see more videos like this from me, then please hit the subscribe button.